Nearly every single disease or illness-based process that human beings directly experience has within it a seed potential to deliver us an alchemical gold if we engage with it in the correct way. If we relate to the process of healing with a model that allows the disease to become a catalyst for whole person change. And the very thing that many people want to fight and to resist is potentially one of the most profound gifts that we can receive. Now, the issue is that modern medicine and modern models of physiology tend to actively block us from the ability to access this kind of relationship to disease. So in today's episode, what we're going to do is actually reestablish a way of relating to disease as a prima materia, as a first matter, as the starting point for profound alchemical change. And hey everybody, my name is Ramon Castellanos. This is the Living Ancestor Podcast, coming to you from Eating Ancient Virtue. And today's episode is going to revolve around this notion of disease as prima materia. So what is prima materia? Well, the technical definition of it is the first matter, because prima means prime, and prime means first. It's also where the word primal and primordial comes from. And materia means matter. So quite literally, we have the first matter or the first material. Now, this term comes to us from alchemy, and it refers to the starting point for an alchemical process. So, for example, that could be taking a metal like lead, and then through a multi-phase process that is formulaic in nature, transmute that lead into gold. And the notion of transmuting lead into gold is one of the examples that you find in alchemy. Many different kinds of materials were used as a first matter or as a prima materia. In fact, there's a lot written about finding the correct prima materia. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Lead is actually a great example for what we're going to be discussing, because lead as a metal is not very useful for many things. It's mostly heavy and not very malleable, and also poisonous. And so for the alchemists who were working with materia, with matter, literally physical matter, and didn't have the level of categorization that we do today in knowing which materials are poisonous and which ones aren't, working with lead usually presented a kind of experience that we could associate very obviously with illness because it poisoned them. And in that case, it would usually make them, heavy and depressed and lethargic and low energy. And when it comes to alchemy, I spoke about this in a previous podcast, quite literally the previous one, when I named an alchemical model of health. One of the things that happens is that you, as the alchemist working with the materia, create a direct sympathetic link with the material. So that whatever you do to the material, you end up doing to the person inside of you, to the being. So if you are heating the material, then you are heating yourself. If you are hammering the material, you are hammering yourself. If you're dissolving the material, you're dissolving yourself. And through a complex formulaic process where you took a prima materia and you transmuted it, you would also then transmute the self. So in the case of lead, the notion then was that the lead could eventually be turned into gold. And so it gives us a beautiful metaphor for the experience of dealing with illness. And I spoke about this in my previous podcast that I myself have had to deal with quite a few pretty intense illnesses that have demanded incredible internal and external change from me at every single level of my life. And it is from this direct experience that I'm speaking to you from today. So, in this case, what we're going to talk about is the body, for one, as being a kind of matter, because it is. It is a materia, quite literally. And a disease state is also then, quite literally, a matter or a materia. But, critically, we're not talking about chemistry, because chemistry, by its very nature, divorces the internal being from the materia. You have chemistry as an art that is purely physical, whereas alchemy always includes the person doing the work. So, realistically, when we're talking about real health change and working with disease and illness in some way that is actively trying to shift it, we're always actually talking about alchemy. Although the map and the model we're given is one that tells us different, and that's a part of what creates the static that sets us at war with disease. The war on cancer, for example. Instead of bringing us into relationship with it, and in that way allowing it to direct and guide us towards a process of transformation and transmutation. And so all of this is going to be discussed. Now, one thing I want to make really clear right from the beginning, and it's important to give you this disclaimer, is that I am not saying with any of this that having a disease is something that should feel easy or that is your fault. Actually, if you would grant me this boon, let's get rid of the notion of fault altogether. There's actually all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with you as a person that people get sick. But this is a critical point. That does not absolve you from the responsibility of having to tend to it and carry it and potentially alchemize it. And that's the reality of it, because it's your body and your experience and you're the one who has to live with it. So whether it's something you want or not, it is your responsibility to tend to it. And everybody has a different degree of response ability in the sense of how able they are to respond to what they're dealing with. And this has to do with the time and place that we were born into, what kind of financial circumstances we have, what the environment around us might support or not. All of that comes into play. So I'm not dismissing it and saying this should be easy or that, hey, it's your fault that you're sick or that you should just be grateful that you have an illness. Although you can feel grateful that you have an illness, and that can be a very healing thing to do. But that's not the point of this. The point of this is to give you an invitation to present a set of possibilities for you that have to do with having an alchemical model for health. So, with that disclaimer in place, let's begin. And let's begin at the beginning, which is that if we're going to be working with disease as a prima materia, it means that disease is in and of itself the starting point of alchemy. It's quite literally the beginning. And so in this case, whatever it is that you might be dealing with, and for the record, I will be going through a very specific example as we get through this podcast and we get further along. I will share with you my own direct experience and then also show you how this kind of thing applies in real time. But that's the starting point here, is whatever it is that you're dealing with, and in this case, it doesn't even need to be a diagnosis. In general, I actually think that a diagnosis is really just, for the most part, a kind of curse that labels a pattern a certain way and that hardens and rigidifies a state of being in your psyche and in your experience. Because now you are a person who has this diagnosis. And so then, in general, you start to identify very deeply with it. And it actually creates a noun out of something that isn't a noun. It is a process. And that's an important consideration, is that everything is already process. I spoke about this, and I've mentioned this podcast already, and I highly suggest you listen to it if you haven't, which is an alchemical model of health. Basically, the nature itself is alchemy. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm, and that disease states and health states are really just process. They're processes that are currently in flux and leading somewhere with either a constructive aspect to them or a destructive aspect to them. But nonetheless, in this case, a diagnosis is a noun. It makes you feel like it's a thing that is in you and that is unabsolvable or that has to be fought and destroyed. But if we step back from that and we just recognize that what modern medicine calls a diagnosis is really just a kind of pattern. It's talking about a pattern that is recognizable and similar to other patterns and that tends to respond in the same way to similar patterns, then we can actually work with the notion of a diagnosis in a way that's helpful and doesn't deliver you a curse, which is the unchanging noun. In fact, anything that is rigid and hardened is something that tends to give us disease states. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the notion of dissolving and recoagulating a little bit later. But, so, let's go with that. Whatever it is that you're experiencing as dis-ease, some kind of interruption in the flow of ease in the system, something that you notice that is simply uncomfortable, that's causing a loss in ability or capacity, that is disruptive in some way, that isn't directly allowing you to do the things that you feel really deeply called to do, etc. Right? So in this way, we can broaden the notion of disease to be a lot of different things. In terms of our direct experience, then that is the starting point. It is that which we want to begin to alchemize. Well, how do we do that? Well, we will get to that. So it's important to give you a little bit of a foundation first, but we will get to that. Now, what's interesting about Prima Materia, the notion of this prime material, was that it was spoken about in a lot of different ways by the ancient alchemist, including in ways that made it sound like it was freely available, always present, cheap, held in contempt, easily discarded, going unnoticed. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, including that alchemy is a vague and opaque art as in general, and that typically asks a person to circle around something over and over and over again in a recursive loop instead of having a directly linear process, which is actually quite helpful when it comes to disease because that's what the experience is like in terms of engaging with it. But in this way, we're actually talking about this kind of experience already. It's the things in us that are often held in contempt, that go unnoticed, that we discard and don't pay attention to, that we would rather not have. It's some kind of a starting point inside the system that is ignored, that we would rather not have. And actually, disease is one of the best ways to approach this because, in fact, again, if we're not working with diagnoses necessarily, but any kind of dis-ease in the system is actually occurring all the time in the sense that that's something that people deal with and often don't notice at all. You know, the discomforts, the aches and the pains, the small symptomology, so to speak, that we just ignore, the places where we shut down our joy, where we shut down our desires, where we don't want to engage with life, where we feel we don't have the energy to do the things we really want to do. All those kinds of things could be thought of as diseases, and also if they pile up enough in the correct pattern, they will give you a full-blown quote-unquote diagnosis or disease, right? They will tie themselves together like a knot and give you a significant illness. Yeah, as a general rule, because most significant illnesses have that kind of knot-like quality where there's a lot of different pieces of life and self that have been quietly ignored for a long period of time, and then they hit this critical mass and suddenly you have cancer or you have heart disease or you have whatever. Also, just to be clear, to cover my own ass, because that's the nature of the world today, I'm not a physician. This is not meant to treat or diagnose any disease, all of that stuff. You're an adult. If you have questions about any of this stuff that specifically come up, speak to a qualified healthcare practitioner, to an acupuncturist, to a doctor of Ayurvedic medicine, to a functional medical practitioner, whatever the case may be. But with that said, yes, most major illnesses have a knot-like quality to them. Now, there are exceptions to this, right? I'm not saying that every single 100% of all cases has the potential to turn it into some grand alchemical gold, right? Because if a person has been poisoned, for example, by large amounts of lead, that can be very difficult to undo. It can be done, and there are people who have been able to actually detoxify and chelate these metals and come back to full health. And I know people who've actually been poisoned and through years of work have steadily regained their vitality and have been transformed in the process. But it is an example, right? There are things that can happen to us that are very difficult to undo. Again, this is an invitation to alchemize what can be alchemized. And if it can be, then that's the point of this talk. So, working with Prima Materia as a starting point, knowing that it is some kind of disease state, things that we typically ignore or hold in contempt, one of the first things that people will encounter, and this is typically the first stage of alchemy, which is called the Nigredo, which is the blackening or the darkening. Now, in the case of working with the Prima Materia, what that would mean is that you're taking a material and typically burning it very intensely in order to blacken it somehow. And that's often the starting point of matter. Now, again, if you are thinking about connecting the internal being to the external material, it means that you just put yourself through some serious freaking heat, right? And you just cooked the system. Now, that can feel very unpleasant. Now, drawing this back to metaphoric experience, one of the things that often feels like is like the Tower card of the tarot, if you're familiar with that. It feels cataclysmic, yeah, because you've just been turned to ash, so to speak. Everything you knew and what you thought has just been pulverized with fire. And that can often be the experience of encountering serious illness. Yeah, you're told all of a sudden that you have cancer or that you have heart disease or that you have some autoimmune disease or something of that nature, and you're feeling all of a sudden like, whoa, what just happened? That's often a wake-up call for people. That in and of itself can be an initiatory experience. Now, whether or not we take that initiatory experience to its full potential is a whole other question altogether, but initiation means to initiate. It often is a starting point, a break away from the old into the new. And so in this case, we quite literally have something that initiates you into a different reality, right? And often that reality comes with this Nigredo-like aspect, which is loss, right? You've just been cooked, hit with fire, turned to ash, blackened, darkened. So what that often means is a loss of health, a loss of options, a loss of ability, a loss of capacity, an emergency state, the need to depend on people, and fear often, and then facing potential feelings around mortality. Yeah. And this is often connected to this starting point. Now, in alchemy, you have multiple phases, and depending on the system of alchemy, there's different phases. More typically and more accepted are the black phase, which is the blackening, the albedo phase, which is the washing phase, where you take the material, that has been blackened, and you wash it somehow. You move it through some kind of a cleansing process in order to re-whiten it, so to speak. Now, these phases can take a long period of time. They are reapplied over and over and over again. Actually, albedo in this way could then be, once we have the Nigredo, then the albedo becomes the alchemical formula that we're going to talk about in a little bit at the level of practical example, that we start to apply to the materia to begin to transmute it somehow. Yeah, that gives us the health regimen, the dietary shifts, the supplement the recommendations that we might get or that we might apply to ourselves. It could give us the different kinds of physical practices and the psychic practices and the magic practices and the astrological practices, and any and all of these things which we're going to talk about can all come and be thought of as the albedo phase. And then once that is locked in long enough, then we start to get to the rubedo phase, or what's called the reddening. And the reddening is where we start to move into the gold phase of the process, or we start to get this alchemical gold. Now, in the case of illness and disease, most people want the rubedo, of course, to be health. Yeah, and that can absolutely be a factor and definitely occur. But there's also another factor here, which is how we are transformed and transmuted as a whole person in the process, either through dissolving the illness and recoagulating into a state of health, or through how we relate to the illness, how we relate to other people, how we relate to our own lives, right? It's about the change that the illness brings with it. That's, in a sense, the whole point. And that change can be a new state of health, or it could be a new state of health and a completely different way of relating to your body and to your own direct experience in life. So that is all present and all possible, and no one can tell you that, because the disease itself carries within it the gold, the outcome. What that's going to be is what that's going to be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you know what? I'll go ahead and talk about it here because it flowed in properly. So one of the things that shows up in alchemy is the notion of following nature. That is, that the alchemists understood that nature was alchemical. And so if you were trying to transmute lead into gold, for example, you were, at default, you were having to work within the laws of nature, because that process was occurring within the intelligence, within the confines, within the possibilities and probabilities established by natural law already. So it was understood then that you had to follow nature. And again, put yourself in the state of the ancient alchemists. They were people who didn't have the same level of quote-unquote scientific knowledge that we do today about the material world. They were dealing with a mystery. To them, when they were dealing with these metals and applying all these different kinds of processes, they didn't know what they were going to get exactly. To them, it was a mysterious process that they themselves were internally sympathetic and resonant with and connected to. So the state of experience that would give you would be so different than what we would think of as typical scientific knowledge today. So in this case, the notion of following nature would actually set us up correctly to begin to understand that we have to follow the intelligence of the disease. And there is in some way a nodding one's hat, a dipping one's head, so to speak, to what the disease is asking of us to do, what the gift inside of it is potentially. And this is going to relate us to timing and to allowing the process to unfold in its own timing. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast on an alchemical model of health and illness, there is an intelligence to disease, the same intelligence that weaves the body together in health, that quite literally unfolds an embryo into an adult human being and then leads into death, is actually an intelligent process. It's not random. And the death process in and of itself is not necessarily a loss of order. It is an intelligence woven into the system already. And so is a disease. So in this case, whatever the disease has for us in store is already wrapped in it. And so it's our job to engage at whatever level we can with the alchemy to unfold the process. So let's go ahead and talk about practical examples. So one of the things that actually happened for me when I was in my worst health throes, so to speak, when I was about 28, 29 years old, which occurred as a result of a very stressful set of experiences. I was living and working in the wilderness of New Mexico at a wolf sanctuary, had bare bones resources, living a very stressful lifestyle, very little in terms of amenities to help, take care and create comfort in life. Along with this, I have certain congenital abnormalities in my hormonal system and the way it works. I was born with certain differences in my brain compared to other people. And then having gone through a very intense and very cataclysmic Kundalini awakening, chi sickness, dragon sickness process when I was 17 that was still with me easily into my early 30s. All of that combined created a state in which my system broke down. And one of the places that it broke down was actually in my heart. So I started to have heart trouble, which showed up as palpitations, a lot of palpitations and very strong palpitations. And that, thankfully, is 95% resolved at this point, which I thank God for. And it has also shown me and been one of the biggest catalytic agents for my own personal growth and transformation and transmutation. So let's step back and I'm going to talk to you about this particular example. So let's take a big picture view and just say issues with the heart, right? I'm not talking about any particular diagnoses. Again, talk to your doctor, right? Talk to your practitioner, whatever that is. But let's say, broadly speaking, heart trouble. Modern Western models of the heart present the heart like a machine. Quite literally, it is thought of as a pump whose job is to move blood. And if there's some kind of issue, it means that something's mechanically wrong with the pump or that there's some blockages in the pipes. This is an incredibly inaccurate way to talk about the heart, and even certain modern models of the heart will talk about it very differently in the sense that the heart is not actually a pump. It's more like an accelerator of the blood that's also shaping the blood as it's leaving the heart a certain way, creating certain kinds of spiral forces as it leaves. And then we also have what has been studied these days as neurocardiology, which is the nervous system of the heart, really popularized by HeartMath, that has seen the heart as an intelligent organ that actually stores memory and that has an electromagnetic field that is 10 times as strong. I believe it's 10, it's possibly more than that. Let's just go with 10. Let's say a lot, a lot stronger than the electromagnetic field of the brain. And so the brain also has electromagnetic receptors for the field coming off the heart. And so what's going on in the heart can quite literally override your cranial brain. So your heart will make decisions. But not only this, the heart is releasing a pressure wave with every beat that touches every single cell in the body. It is touched by circulation. So quite literally the whole system is attuning to the frequency of the heart. And there's a lot more that could be said. And those are modern models. If we were to step back into older models, the heart is often thought of as adjacent or actually the seat of the soul of the person. In Chinese medicine, they call the heart the emperor of organs because it directs everything. And if we recognize this pressure wave phenomenon and this electromagnetic field phenomenon we were just talking about, the heart itself is actually the orchestrator of the symphony of the body. So if something is wrong with the heart, everything in the system is off. Conversely, also, if there's other things in the system that are very off, the heart may be one of the places where it's most readily apparent. Yeah? Because the heart is, again, this central organ that, if we take this model, already steps us out of the heart as a pure mechanical pump. Yeah? Now, with that said, let's think about the heart in its physical location. It is in the chest, which is connected to the breath. And so, if a person is dealing with some kind of heart trouble, you have the actual pressure dynamics inside the chest. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but most modern humans have a ton of tension inside their chest and in their pericardium. Now, the pericardium is a sac. It's like a fascial sac that is readily apparent here. For those of you who are listening on audio, I'm contracting the muscles around my neck to show these a mesh-like network that moves through the neck and actually goes into the chest and holds the heart. It's this sac that quite literally surrounds and holds the heart. Now, a lot of people have a lot of tension in their pericardium, and what that happens is that it squeezes the heart itself, cutting off the flow of energy of the heart into the organism. Now, also, people will have quite literally physical tension around the heart. And the ability to relax the pericardium and to relax the pressure inside and around the heart is one level where we start to look at a simple thing that's often ignored. So, releasing the pressure around the heart physically. Then we also have the breath, which a lot of people with heart trouble have distorted breathing rhythms. Now, I myself had an enormous amount of tension in my pericardium, especially down the left side of my neck and into my chest. And also, I was constantly bracing around the heart. So it's taken a lot of internal work with practices like Tai Chi, Qigong, and other kinds of breathing practices to learn how to resolve that tension. And why was I bracing that way? Why was my nervous system feeling like it had to hold on to that? Well, there's all kinds of internal reasons. And one could say just living in constant fight or flight mode. And I've been able to release that. Now, also, there is the allowing of the energy of the heart to flow from releasing that tension. Then the breath, as I was just saying. So breath now, I also had very disrupted breathing rhythms. So much so that when I first started doing breath practice many years ago, trying to do regular breathing exercises the way that people were telling me I should was actually making my palpitations worse because of the pressure dynamics and the distortion of my breathing. It was actually creating a pressure wave inside the heart that was disrupting its rhythm and not actually helping. So I've had to transform and transmute my whole relationship to the breath. And the breath is how we relate to life. So being able to take a full breath is being able to take in a full influx of life. Being able to exhale is the same. Now, the heart is also deeply connected to the nervous system and to what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. That is the body's ability to calm the system down. It's a branch of the nervous system responsible for calming people down. So in this, I've also done a bunch of vagal nerve work. And I've had to learn to chill out because the vagal nerve is the largest nerve in the body that is the biggest powerhouse of the parasympathetic rest or digest branch of the nervous system. So vagal nerve work helps calm and stabilize the heart. So I've had to do a bunch of that. Now stepping into the heart more as a part of an energetic system. If the energy flowing through your body cannot move out into your arms, and it's known in energetic systems the world over that the arms are an extension of the heart, then energy and heat start to accumulate in the chest, which then disrupts, again, the working of the heart. So I myself also had a ton of tension in my shoulders and in my elbows and in my wrist, and the flow of energy into my arms was very blocked. It took years of work with different systems of qigong and physical work to unlock the flow of energy into my arms. Now, with that, as we were just talking about the flow of energy in the body, I've also had to release a ton of tension around the diaphragm so that everything in the chest can relax and move downward, and that the breath could open up. With this, I've done a ton of work at the level of the heart and opening up my heart more, because my heart was very closed down from many years of what I would call, for a lack of a better word that is encompassing enough without getting into a 10-minute talk, I'm going to say trauma. Although I would have a more nuanced explanation of what was actually occurring, but there was a deep belief in my system that I was unlovable, that people would always abandon me, that I couldn't have friends, that I was unworthy, and all of that stuff made me close down around my heart. And so there has an enormous amount of internal healing around the heart that has had to happen so that this layer of personality, of rigidified, hardened personality, could release and something else could take its place, something more authentic. There's also in that way been the need to connect to ancestors at a heart level and to open up a sense of my own soul being more present in my life, because again, the heart and the soul are connected. There's been a work around diet, right? So people, for example, who often have heart issues are often told that they need to address their diet, and that is a huge factor. Yeah, addressing diet is a big piece of it. Yeah, but so is physical exercise and physical movement. And so I've already had that going on, but I have had to refine what I do and how I do it in order for it to be heart healthy and not heart damaging. And that has actually been really different than what the classical typical advice is, because for me, high intensity interval training and really intense training don't seem to make my heart healthier. If anything, they tend to do the opposite and worsen the condition of my heart. Whereas deep qigong, internal martial arts, deep circulation work, being in nature more, walking, these kinds of things are what make my heart healthy. For example, so in that example, I've already talked about a lot of things. That's me, and it could look different for everybody, but some of these things will apply to most people in some form or fashion. You have a variety of layers. You have the actual physical heart and the pressure around it. You have the energetic flow through it. And then you also have the spirit or the soul of the heart as well, because the heart is the organ of joy in Chinese medicine. So the heart is responsible for courage and joy in its healthy state. So when we unlock the flow of the heart, that's what floods the organism, is a radiance of consciousness. So someone's brighter, that they also have access to joy, not necessarily mania, which is thought of as too much heart energy, but joy, and also that there is a sense of courage and an ability to move along with what's actually important in life. Yeah, to follow one's heart, to do the things that fill one's heart, that brings one's heart joy and gladness. Yeah, that's an aspect of a healthy heart, and those were aspects that I needed to work on. So one way to think about this is that you're working at the level of matter, or in terms of like substance. So the pressure, the tissues around the heart. You're working with energy, the flow of energy through the heart, and you're working with spirit, or Shen, which is the term for spirit in Chinese, of the heart. And so if you're dealing with a particular health challenge, then those are the layers that you want to work with. If we're going back to the Chinese model, which I really enjoy using, we're talking about Jing, which is physical substance, Qi, which is energy, and Shen, which is spirit. And so you'd be working at all three levels with whatever it is. So now let's apply this in a completely different context and saying something neurological. There's something going on with your brain. Well, what does that mean at those levels? Or you're working at the level of the guts. Well, what does that mean? At that level, you could be, working with different kinds of intestinal manipulations, massage at the level of the guts, taking supplements for the guts, working with whatever trauma is stored in the guts and releasing those things, working on the tensional patterns in the guts. Again, some basic examples. And all of this has to be held in the context of understanding health in general, and establishing a proper foundation for what is healthy in general, and also, of course, working at an ancestral layer. And I talked about this in a previous podcast, that a lot of things that happen health-wise are really animal level deviations from our evolved inherited nature from tribal people, and how modern humans are not doing those things. But within all of that, there's also this ability to work at this level of working with this kind of deeper way of alchemizing. And so this is alchemy because we're quite literally taking something that is rigidified and hardened, which is whatever the disease state is, the knot that we were speaking about earlier, that has all these different layers, and we're dissolving them through a practice that could be thought of as the albedo, the washing, the dissolving phase, over and over and over again on a consistent basis. And then what ends up happening after the dissolution is done is that we recoagulate. We bring it all back together into a new form, into a greater form that gives us that golden state that we were looking for. So at this point, I have a very different relationship to my heart than I did back when. So even when I was, when I wasn't dealing with these heart issues and I was younger, my relationship with my heart now is so different because of that, because of this state. So that is diseases prima materia, is how we deal with it, is that the disease is a starting point for then these different states of practice and approach that take on the Jing, Qi, and Shen levels across the whole person. I'll step it back too and say that a big part of what I needed to also do was move from where I was living in New Mexico to Hawaii, where I get in the ocean on a regular basis, where I'm getting sunlight on a regular basis, where I'm connected to the earth and I love the land here. And so the land has been a major ally in helping me. But as you notice, a big part of why I moved was because of my health. Yeah, because it had gotten to the point where I knew I needed to be in a healing place. So quite literally, my health has been one of the biggest catalysts for me. And I could give you many more examples of how health has been one of the things that has driven me the most in my life and has led to some of the most profound states of growth in the pursuit of this alchemizing of diseases prima materia. Yeah, so, everybody has a different mileage and everybody's in a different state of circumstances. What I can say is that oftentimes the external solution, the practice, the supplement, the dietary change, the move that has to happen, the new way of living, comes when the internal being is ready to receive it. I want to really sit that down on your lap and have you hold it and stroke it like a cat. That is an important consideration, is that the inner being has to be ready for the shift. And then if, there's some luck on your side, then the things that you need can start to show up. And I'll tell you something, everybody has at least a little bit of luck on their side. So with that, what ends up happening is, transformation and transmutation. You start to get the gold. And the gold could be health, that you are returned to a state of health. Maybe you're actually healthier at a whole person level than you've ever been before. So, you might actually end up healthier than you were before you had the illness. If you look at health as this total whole organism synchronization. Because in the modern Western world, we're told that health is the absence of symptoms. But what if health is the integrity, the symphonic wholeness of the whole organism and the being that is inside and interfacing with that organism, and that there's a deeper unity between all these different layers of self. And in that way, this illness, even if you still have some of it, so to speak, but living with it has asked you to change all kinds of things so that you're living in a different place, so that you're not cooking the candle at both ends, so to speak, and stressing your system out, so that you're more connected to ancestral life ways, so that you have a deep personal practice that helps you cultivate yourself. Then I would say that you're actually healthier as a result of that. Even if there's some considerations you need to make for some of the limitations that carrying that illness might have. So it's a different way to approach it. Anyway, this podcast is long enough. I hope it's been useful to you. And it's been a pleasure having you here. If you appreciate what I do, I would love it if you came and joined me at my Substack called Eating Ancient Virtue. And just, for free, signing up with your emails just so that I can stay in contact with you and send you these videos and other cool things when I do them. All right, my friends, be well.